In this chapter, I'm going to talk about how we can achieve deep decarbonization. That means not only to stop the increase of human-made carbon dioxide emissions, but actually get those emissions down to zero within the next few decades, a process called deep decarbonization. Remember what we face. We have to keep global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius and pursue efforts to keep warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. But the carbon budget is almost spent. We cannot go on even another generation at the current emissions rates without bursting the carbon budget. So the message to us is very strong and very clear. We have to move away from CO2 emissions. Remember that most of CO2 emissions come from burning coal, oil, and gas, and another important part comes from deforestation and other land use change. To achieve deep decarbonization, we have to approach both the energy system transformation and the land use system transformation in order to get down to zero. What you see in front of you is a famous graph of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's an icon of the climate change community. That graph shows several scenarios for the path of future CO2 emissions. The dotted points in black that you see starting at the beginning of this curve around 1980 and going up to around 2015, the little dots show the rising actual path of emissions. And this is measured in the vertical axis in units of carbon, not carbon dioxide. So to get it into units of carbon dioxide, you have to multiply by the atomic weight of CO2 relative to the atomic weight of C. That's a ratio of 3.66. So if we're emitting 10 billion tons of carbon every year, we're emitting about 36 billion tons of carbon dioxide. That's what the graph shows. Now there are 4 scenarios on this graph. There's a line that just keeps going up. That's a kind of business as usual path. Then there's a line that keeps going up but not as fast. That's a modest amount of control. Then there's a line that peaks and starts coming down. Then there's a line that peaks just in the next few years and heads down to zero, and I want you to pay attention to zero, as of around 2070. Keep your eye on that lower path, because that is a path of deep decarbonization. That's what the Intergovernmental Panel put forward as a path consistent with a likely achievement, remember that means 2/3 probability, of staying below 2 degrees Celsius. We have to do better than that path. We have to be even steeper and get to zero even faster than that path, because we're aiming not just to stop warming below 2 degrees, but well below 2 degrees. But the point is very strong that in order to do that, we have to get to zero emissions. Zero is a strong number, by the way. It means we can't go on burning fossil fuels the way we're doing it and say, oh, we're going to take a little bit care, we're going to turn off the lights, we're going to be a little bit more energy efficient. That doesn't do it. We have to get to zero emissions and peak quickly and start bringing these emissions down sharply if we're going to live within the carbon budget. So, what did the Paris Climate Agreement tell countries they need to do? 2 big things. They said to every signatory, and there are 196 signatories to this agreement, 193 member states of the United Nations, and then 2 affiliated states, Niue and Cook Islands, and then the European Union. Added up, 196 signatories. Every one of them has to put forward a contribution to turning the emissions down and staying within the carbon budget. Now, they didn't use the phrase carbon budget because our governments weren't brave enough to use it. But the idea is turn the emissions down sharply and stay within the carbon budget, and in 2 time horizons. One is the short term. It says each party shall prepare, communicate, and maintain successive nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, that it intends to achieve. A nationally determined contribution means that the United States or the UK or France or Togo or Ghana or China says, here's what we will contribute to turning emissions down, an NDC. And we state what our objective is, and that's generally up to the year 2030, or in the case of the United States, 2025, a relatively short-term contribution. Then in another part of Article 4, Article 4.19 as opposed to Article 4.2 for the NDCs, countries commit to making longer-term plans to mid-century. And in this clause it says that all parties should formulate and communicate long-term, low greenhouse emission development strategies. That's what brings us together, is what should be the content of those long-term strategies. So every country has to put nationally determined contributions and has to put on the table a long-term development strategy. My point is we need to get to zero. We need deep decarbonization. And that entails big changes in energy systems and big changes in land use. On energy systems, we have to shift a world energy system dependent on coal, oil, and gas to an energy system dependent on zero carbon or non-carbon primary energy sources, or a specific set of technologies that say you can use the carbon sources, but we capture the carbon dioxide, don't let it into the atmosphere or take it out of the atmosphere. And at the same time, we have to shift from cutting down the rainforests to building them back up. We have to shift from degrading land that reduces the carbon dioxide into biological storage and replenish and restore those ecosystems so that more carbon dioxide is captured there. Again, I'm going to focus mainly on energy. And what we know about energy is that moving to zero net emissions is feasible. We can even see what the technology pathway is, but it's not easy. We can do it, but we have to move, really move quickly. One reason we have to move quickly is that it's going to take a long time to make this transformation. We have power plants, buildings, automobiles that are going to last a decade or two in the case of automobiles, 40 years in the case of power plants, maybe 100 years in the case of buildings. And so we need to retrofit them. We need to make sure that every new power plant is clean and green as the old ones are decommissioned. In other words, we have to move now because it's going to take quite a while to turn that whole energy system into a zero emission system.